right, everyone. Welcome to our 31st rental roundtable. We've got Andres on from Uber. Andres, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me, Kyle. Super excited to chat with you and to your group here.
Yeah. Well, I like to think life is short, but relationships are long. And I was obviously on your team at Uber 5 years ago before starting Quipli. And we generally bring on rental operators and people in the rental space to this podcast. It's a rental themed podcast, but I'm particularly excited to talk to you because I think there's a lot of learnings from Uber and to make rental companies operate better, particularly on using technology, using data, and then on the pricing stuff. And how do you set dynamic pricing to increase utilization, increase revenue? And that is your sort of wheelhouse here. So, a lot to talk about and very excited to jump in here. So, Andres, love if you just sort of start off, talk about your journey with Uber. You've been there over 10 years, the early days through IPO. You've seen ups and downs and a ton of awesome stuff there. And we're going to get into some of the pricing stuff here in a little bit, but love if you wanted to start off and tell us about your Uber journey and how you've gotten to where you are today.
Yeah, absolutely. I started at Uber back in 2015, and journey has definitely been super interesting. And obviously, to stay anywhere for 10 years, it's got to be pretty interesting and pretty compelling. I've just found the work that I've done is always interesting. The people that I worked with are always super smart. So that's what's kept me where I am. And I'm currently running our marketplace operations team for the US and Canada. So doing a lot with pricing and thinking a lot about how Uber users sort of interact with our platform on a day-to-day, week-to-week, and even sort of longer term basis. But yeah, I started back in 2015, coming right out of business school. And, my immediate sort of impression was that, they were basically asking me to do a ton of everything. And everything back then was super manual and interesting. But even back then, you could kind of tell that, hey, this is a really data-driven place where um, data and how you think about success and how you measure your success are just sort of in foundationally ingrained in the culture. So what I mean by manual is that a lot of our sort of tooling and a lot of our processes weren't really built out. And so I had days where, I was cleaning toilets at our customer support center, right? And, coming out of business school. And then I was also, we used to run what we would call marketing stunts. So we would run Uber ice cream stunts where you could order an ice cream cone through an Uber. And so one of my first projects was that I had to order $2,000 worth of dry ice on my personal credit card and figure out how to get all of that plus ice cream into 40 cars in the Washington D.C. area, and then how to actually make that happen. But then at the same time, I was thinking about, hey, how do we think about how we get the right drivers to the right places at the right time? Thinking about our utilization, how many drivers do we need? um, what type of promotion would be valuable to get them there? How much are we sort of willing to pay for that incremental trip and that incremental utilization? Back then, a mix of data and super manual, and then over time, as we got better at automating a lot of these manual processes, we built out support teams, so I wasn't doing as much support, and we got really good at specializing in things like, in things like pricing. So that's been my journey, is that I started very general and then ended up specializing over time.
Started general ordering, ice creams and Ubers, and then moved towards pricing side. I'm sure that's not what you studied at MIT for your MBA was how to order ice cream cones to an Uber. But part of being scrappy, right, is doing what it took to scale the business. I'm curious back
Yeah,
in
Kyle, and I'll
2015.
also add that it also gave me a really good understanding of who our customers were and how they thought. Like at Uber, I think I would say that we have run a two-sided marketplace. So we have consumers and then we have earners, and we have to think about how we and serve them both and think about their experience. And so I think everyone can associate with a lot of people at Uber can associate with the rider side, but not as many kind of know and understand the consumer, the supply side. And so that was really critical for me coming in to truly understand, hey, who are these people? What do they value? What are their pain points?
Mm,
That's sort of really ingrained into pricing as well. It's not just a kind of a numbers and utilization game. It's really important to know who is the person that's interacting with your product and interacting with your price, and what do they value.
mm. I mean, it's easy. I mean, when I worked at Uber, it was so analytical, like data, numbers, and that's what part of what made Uber special. You're talking about, well, there's people behind the numbers, right? And how did you learn about how the drivers operated, what made them tick? Because you can't always see that in a spreadsheet. Was it the support role you had, showing up in person, talking to drivers? How did you really learn what drivers really cared about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a way we did it back then, the way we still do it today. Yeah, I think back then, in 2015, I was sort of the one of the frontline support people for Uber, and so every day I had to have conversations about you know, earners coming in and asking for support, or giving me unsolicited and a lot of times very real feedback around, hey, you guys are doing this in your marketplace. It's not quite working for me. And having a really good feedback loop to then go back and go back to the lab, so to speak, and figure out how does this insight connect to what we're doing, and then what changes do we make to try to act on that.
Mm. Yeah, and did that experience, 10 years ago being frontline support in a sense and building that up, does that still help you today, 10 years later, when you're, running a whole team of analysts and you're thinking about pricing, A/B tests, things like that? Do you still think about some of those experiences early on, spending time with drivers?
Absolutely, you have to. Yeah, I mean, you have to always have that customer experience perspective to really understand and connect what you're doing in your spreadsheet to like what's the impacts in real
Mm.
life.
Yeah. And do you ever have situations where what you're seeing in the data doesn't align with what you're feeling and seeing in the field? Like, is there ever a discrepancy, and what do you do at that point?
Yeah, there's often, I think, when you look at averages, they don't tell you the full story.
Mm,
And so something we do a ton at Uber is look at the worst 10% experience and the best 10% experience.
mm,
And recognizing that a driver, if they're doing 100 trips a week, they're having that worst 10% 10 times a week. That's really
yeah.
bad.
Yeah.
So yeah, oftentimes those worst experiences, if you have a really high volume business, are going to be what's driving some, significant change or significant trends.
Yeah. I was actually reading Poor Charlie's Almanac last week about Charlie Munger. One of the things he said was the same thing, ignore averages, because it's like the story of the guy who drowned in the river that was an average of 18 inches deep. Well, on average, yeah, but it had dropped down to 30 feet. You can't swim, right? That actually matters. That's interesting. A lot of what you guys are thinking about is ignoring the middle 80, but like, how do we make the worst 10% go away and the best 10% sort of stick, right? That's an interesting insight. The averages can tell misleading stories and probably tell you stories that make you feel better, but it's not actually what's happening in reality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to go back to like your early days. You've done a lot at Uber. You've sort of your superpower really is you're an analytical machine and really understood the pricing side super well. and obviously the rental industry, people who've heard me talk about is there is a need for dynamic pricing in the industry, right? Hotels do it, airlines do it. When you have generally fixed supply and fluctuating demand, you should set prices to increase utilization. And increased utilization doesn't always mean surge pricing. I think that's what people scare people off is I don't want to just jack the prices up on my customers. It's about sometimes lowering rates too, in times of lower demand as well. And where Uber is now, everyone knows the magic. You click a button and the price and everything's just magic, right? And it's been that way for a while. And there's a lot of advanced algorithms you guys are working on. But the rental industry is now moving more towards dynamic pricing. United Rental, Sunbelt Rental are doing, the Nationals are doing it, and there's growing demand. I hear from independents wanting to start testing some of these things. I'm curious from your experience at Uber when you were first getting started and starting to test different pricing structures, et cetera. Tell me about that experience, and in particular, I want to think about how we can apply that to the rental industry.
Yeah, I mean, I I think I can go back to really early sort of Uber principles here and really connect that to like those principles to what even what we're doing today. And so really Uber as you said is trying to be more advanced in its pricing stack. Like when you think about like Uber relative to taxis, there were the biggest sort of difference was that surge dynamic pricing. And at the
Mm,
heart of that is that we want to make sure that we're balancing the supply side of the market with the demand side of the market. And that both real like both sort of leads to maximizing a business outcome, but also it results in a better experience if you really want to ride. Um, so what one of the you know good things about Surge is that it's sort of setting the marketplace clearing price, and it's helping you never run out of of cars in a marketplace. So that's one reason why you set higher prices so you don't sort of stock out. And it Search does that in a way that um, looks at prices across time, across space, sort of within a given city.
mm,
And then time is throughout the day, but also throughout the months. So, during a slow period, let's say it gets really cold and people don't want to walk, the average price will go up. And that will also, be a signal to your supply side that, hey, more, it's a higher earnings season, and so let's sign on or let's stay on for longer. Um, and then, we're not getting as much sort of supply demand through our to get a ride, but it's also not leading to a situation where you can't get a ride because prices are too low. And that's really sort of the foundation of a lot of Uber pricing. Um, so I don't know. I think thinking about how you apply that to the rental industry, I think one of the advantages of how Uber is able to do that is that it has a lot of information about the marketplace, more than any individual sort of actor in the marketplace. And so it's able to use all of that information to make the marketplace run more efficiently. Um, so anyway, I would say that an independent sort of actor in a marketplace can get more information about how other competitors are pricing, what is the sort of anticipated level of activity in your market next month, in the next quarter. That is something that information is something that you yourself as an independent actor can then use to set your prices, to sort of use that principle of trying to balance supply and demand.
mm. You said a lot there. I have several questions. I think just going back to what you initially said, right? And you sort of ended with that too. Like the framing is how do we balance supply and demand in a market? And the two reasons you mentioned why that's important. One, maximize business outcomes, right? And that, the Uber and the rental industry, their businesses to generate profit, right? Number one. But number two, I think it sort of gets lost when we talk to a lot of rental companies around why you should think about a more dynamic pricing structure, less of a static pricing structure. When I talk about static, there are rental companies who will update their rates once per year. And they have a daily, a weekly, a monthly rate, and maybe there's a weekday, weekend rate, but that's it. And no matter what else is happening in the market, they won't change the rates. But the second part you said is it's about the experience and really avoiding stockouts, right? And avoiding stockouts for the people who really care about it. And if you really care about it, you'll pay more for it, right? And I think the experience, and we probably all had at some point, you in a random city, and maybe less common now, but you call an Uber and it's nothing available, and there's nothing more frustrating with that. And you really couldn't put a price on that, right? If you really need something, you will pay for it. And the pricing stuff that you've been working on at Uber sort of solves that problem, right? By using pricing to sort of gauge a willingness to pay. So I think that's interesting. I was talking about the user experience because the initial impact. Maybe I'd ask a question for you is if you're a rental company, and I hear this a lot. Well, that sounds great, but I don't want to surge price people. That's just going to be a bad experience. Obviously, Uber solved it, but how would you answer that question? This all sounds great, but I don't want to just surge pricing on our best customers randomly. How do you communicate that? How do you communicate why this is important? How do you actually get that through to the end renters?
Yeah, I think there's a ton there, Kyle. Certainly like you have to balance that short-term efficiency, purely numbers-based approach to running your marketplace with um, that longer-term impact on customers, right? So if you were to vary your prices too much, a customer might say, "Hey, that's unfair. I'm going to go somewhere else." Right?
Mm,
So you might be getting a more efficient marketplace, but you're also sort of losing a loyal customer. And you really have to balance those two things because you don't want to get more sophisticated and really good and sort of like that really fine-tuned short-term pricing, but then risk losing loyal customers. So, I think there are different ways to think about how to vary prices, right? Like people have sales. Sales are a way to vary your price. And that kind of signals, right, hey, like this lower price during a slower period isn't permanent. The other way that you could do it is have, sort of a membership program. And Uber has a membership program, right? And what do you get for that membership? You sort of pay a subscription fee, and you're sort of if you use Uber Eats, you get discounts on a fee. So that's a way to say, hey, members get some shielding from these higher, more volatile prices, and then non-members that might be less loyal, don't don't sort of have that 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 shielding.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because rental companies will have there's different segments of end users. You have the homeowners is a segment, then you usually have contractors, and contractors sometimes will have pre-negotiated rates, and they usually get credit terms. They'll pay you net 30. It's a different type of customer. They're usually higher willingness to pay and generally more important sometimes to the rental company. You could think about something similar, sort of membership style, right? Where the first time renter, you log into the website and you're going to see the price that's sort of dynamically priced, right? But if you have rented with me 100 times and you've got an open account, you may have pre-negotiated rates. Those rates may change seasonally throughout the year, but the volatility is much smaller. That's sort of what you're saying, right? It's maybe with the membership program at Uber, if you are a member, the swings of the volatility on the pricing is less, and you sort of pay with loyalty for that. Is that right?
Yeah, I think using membership as a way to reward your most loyal customers, I think is definitely a methodology. The other one that I wanted to also mention is sort of differentiating your level of service, or having pricing be tied to the level of service, and
Mm,
and and also to your costs as well. So at Uber, right, we've got different products we think of. We have Uber X, we have Uber Pool that's now called Share, and we've got Uber Comfort. And I'm oversimplifying it, right?
Yeah.
But like that pricing sort of mirrors the level of service that you're likely going to get, right? You with Uber Pool or Uber Share, like you're going to pay less, but you have to share the car. So that's sort of like a lower level of service. With Uber Comfort or Uber Black, you're going to pay more, but you get a nicer car. So like having pricing reinforce the value that the customer gets sort of allows customers to like self-select a little bit. Like if you really, really care about low prices, then okay, we'll give you low prices, but you sort of get like maybe less customer support or less responsive repairs when you have downtime, or I don't know, maybe lower like less access to new equipment. And again, I don't know the equipment rental industry, but I actually did listen to a few of your podcasts, Kyle, and heard a bit of the those themes coming through. So I don't know if those are ideas that people would think about.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, and on the Uber one, maybe if you pay a lot of money, you'll give us some ice cream. Andres will be in the car, and for the right price, you deliver some ice cream cone. Um, but I do think like for a given piece of equipment, you could price it the same weekly rental. You could price with different levels of service. Maybe for the Uber X price, you got to pick it up and you got to bring it back yourself, right? But for the Uber Black, you get it delivered. You get guaranteed 24/7 concierge service. If something breaks, you could price the same rental with different sort of value added features um,
Yeah.
alongside.
You had a guy in your last podcast that was talking about him having to go out and sort of like do a repair on his own, and like how his customers really valued that, right? And
Mm.
that's something you can maybe price in, right? Like that is a really nice value add that differentiates sort of local players from national players. But
Yeah, and if
uh,
you listen to a few of the episodes, and I've obviously been on every one and listening, the customer service is super important. Like that's what differentiates the independents from the national players is the level of service, it's responsiveness, it's the relationship, it's being able to be on site. We talked to a group, the fastest growing group in Canada, and they regularly post on their LinkedIn, "Hey, got a service call at 2 a.m. We were there," right? That's sort of what they live for. Do you think you could price for that too? Like, I mean, I guess what I'm saying is there potentially is a way to not just do this as a loss leader, but actually like you can price and charge more for the extra service, right? Is that sort of where you're going here?
yeah, or you could it'd be tough if people are already sort of used to that. Maybe you then just price lower um, for less service, and have give people the option to have a lower price with less service, and then you still are able to maintain that sort of baseline of high, normal price and high service.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about is you mentioned you're sort of getting with the volatility of how often you're changing prices. Like if you go on Uber, sometimes you refresh your app every 2 minutes, you get a new price, right? And that's sort of what people expect and want is the real time at this moment in time. How much does it cost? For rental companies, you may not want to change prices every 5 minutes, right? And maybe it's every week or every 2 weeks or every month. And I think something we'll need to figure out as an industry is how often should prices change. But I think one of the learnings it sounds like you've had is how frequently you're updating prices matters depending on who your end user is.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some like anchoring there with like how the industry has done it that's
Yeah.
hard to get away from. Like you think about different industries, Uber, very real-time pricing, airlines, very real-time pricing, gas stations, very real-time pricing. Do customers like that? I don't know. I can't I can't say one way or the other across industries that it's like something that people like, but some I
They
think
accept it though. They may not like it, but they accept it, you know?
yeah. Yeah, and like, the price of eggs, the price of milk also like can vary on a week over week basis. So I think it depends on kind of anchoring, like what's the industry norm, what's the Um, and yeah, what are people used to? And then also like how much information do you have to even be able to price really like to price really like volatilely. Like so Uber has a ton of information, but as our equipment rental, provider, you might only have sort of monthly information on trends, or you're using your own sort of internal information around how much stock you have. So I think there are limits to there are limits like feasibly about just being able to do it, and then also just like industry norms and the customer reaction to doing it
Hmm.
to consider.
I'm thinking back, everyone who's listening is likely taking an Uber. You remember that first experience and it felt like magic almost, right? And now Uber is just sort of a common part of our lives. I'm curious from your perspective, like what are some of the major decisions that Uber made early on that led to the disruption in the ride hailing industry? Like what are the main two or three things that really made customers fall in love with Uber? Was it the digital app? Was it the pricing transparency? I guess what I'm particularly interested in is how important was pricing into getting the adoption that Uber had, and how quickly that moved people from calling taxis to calling Ubers, because it happened, felt like overnight. How important was pricing in driving that consumer adoption?
Yeah, I don't know if I could I don't know if I could like give you an order of how important it was. It was certainly important, but like you got to compare it to this experience of on a, on our Saturday night going out in Arlington, Virginia as a mid 20-year-old before Uber. You would have to call the cab company and get a dispatcher, and the dispatcher would give you a time, and
Mm.
y- that time was never accurate, right?
Yeah.
And then you'd have so like that, like knowing when, having some certainty around when that car was coming was super important.
Mm.
Uh, Also, cab drivers would tell you like if you wanted to go from downtown to Virginia, downtown DC to Virginia, and on a late at night, they would say no. They would turn you down.
Mm.
That doesn't really happen in an Uber. So that experience um was also sort of a differentiator. I remember there was a time where a lot of cabs wouldn't accept credit cards, and
Mm.
so like payment method. I think there was just it's hard to say that pricing was the thing. There was just so much experientially that was just better. Um,
Yeah, and I'm just I mean, it's just interesting. Obviously, like Uber is a two-sided marketplace, rental companies and who we work with. It's a vertical SaaS, it's an independent rental company. But I think the themes of what made Uber successful are starting to happen in the rental industry. And you mentioned, I think it's probably like three buckets. One is the reliability part. Number two is convenience, and three is transparency. I think all those things matter because what we're seeing in the rental industry, because I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, is there's still majority of orders are done in person or over the phone. And although we see online orders 20%, 25%, that's been growing every year, majority is still a certain way of doing it. It's so very similar to calling a cab in 2010 or 2015, right? But I think what we've seen for rental companies that are winning right now and avoiding commoditization is it's the reliability part, and that's just not it's not just a software side, but your equipment's got to work. You got to be and people pay for that. It's got to work. It's going to be on time. I want to call you and I want you to have it, and that's part of balancing supply and demand is making sure you have equipment available. Number one, reliability. Number two, convenience is Gen Z and millennials are taking over, right? They don't want to call. They want to order their coffee on their phone. They want to order the Uber, Amazon, and they want to rent stuff on their phone. And we're seeing even on the websites we host, 60% of all sessions are now mobile, right? And you're like, of course. But in the rental industry, that's a change that's happening. And the third is transparency, and it's transparency for a lot of things. I think we're seeing a lot of rental companies actually show real-time availability on their website, which people have been hesitant to do because it gives your competitors sort of an insight. But also the pricing, even having pricing online is a new change in the last 5 years. And it's not just the list price, but it's including the taxes and the delivery and the damage waiver and the final price that you pay, like the actual price that you pay. And I think what I'm seeing is the companies that are winning in the industry it's very similar to how Uber won, right? It was reliability, convenience, transparency. I think there's a lot of lessons for rental companies to learn how Uber succeeded by leaning into some of these values that maybe feel counterintuitive for a business owner.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I think yeah, being able to sort of up level the booking experience, big differentiator. And I haven't rented construction equipment myself, so I'm not as well versed in the state of the industry, but yeah, certainly that's super important. Um, yeah, customer support we didn't mention, important as well. Reliability, like are you getting what you thought you were getting when you bought it? Are you getting it on time? Are you getting it, high quality
Yeah,
things?
if you go back to the taxis, 2005 or 2010, it was things were good, maybe we'll make this tweak, and Uber came in and totally disrupted everything. And I don't think an Uber is going to come into the rental industry. I'm not saying that. I actually don't believe that's going to happen, but it could. But I think the biggest thing is like I think disruption from the national players because consolidation's sort of at an all-time high. Every week you read about another national company that bought an independent, and the independents are getting squeezed. There's pricing pressure, and if you don't differentiate, I think there is a risk of sort of getting swallowed up. And I think what happened with ride hailing was like pretty drastic. It felt like night and day. Taxis that Uber flipped, I feel like in 6 months, and I'm not saying that will happen in the rental industry, but I think rental companies need to lean into some of the technology and best practices from Uber to avoid being disrupted, right? That's sort of what I'm getting at. I think pricing is sort of the thing that really matters, but I think it's all this ties together. I just think 2024, it's not 10 years different from 2014. It's 100 years. I think things have accelerated so quickly that the companies that are adapting and leading into change technology are going to be the ones to win. And that's why I wanted to talk to you because, like, I think Uber did that really well, and I think there's a lot of lessons for rental companies who can learn from how Uber was successful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Uber not only disrupted on price, it disrupted on level of service. So if I'm a smaller player, you don't want, maybe someone can disrupt you on price because they're coming in and they get economies of scale because they're a national player and they've got a, better cost structure that you just can't match. But you're going to be able to differentiate on level of service. And for some people that matters a ton.
So if I'm a rental company and I'm like, okay, this sounds great, we should start thinking about more sophisticated pricing strategies. I'm not going to have a team of data scientists and AI and trillions of data points, right? I update my prices once per year. What would be like, crawl, walk, run, you know, two or three initial sort of data points or metrics to look at when I'm thinking about being more flexible in how I'm pricing with the goal of, right, maximizing business outcomes and also increasing the user experience. What would be like the two or three in your mind most important variables for rental companies to start thinking about?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, I think looking at what margins are you making? Um, Margins maybe by product level, so like product category.
Hmm.
Is there anywhere where, you know, you're seeing um not enough, what I'm gonna say, throughput or volume, where prices, if you charge lower prices, you could make that up in higher volume.
Hmm.
Uh, is there anywhere where your prices are maybe too high and not competitive, and so you could make that up with um yeah, make up lower prices with higher volume. Yeah, at the end of the day, you're trying to um maximize your value uh to your company. You're trying to recover your costs at a minimum. and you're trying to utilize your assets to the best, the sort of the best way possible. And so, and I'd say looking at those data points across the year to see if there's value in, if we're seeing a lot of seasonality in your marketplace, trying to look at, um, are there tweaks you could make on the margin to try to better match your pricing with that supply demand condition, sort of at the like seasonal or quarterly level, even I think. Um, and so then the next question is, okay, if you see that opportunity, how do you do that without, isolating customers? You could do that through sales. Um, you could do that through just, re changing prices, sort of your sticker price. You could do that through maybe differentiating your level of service, sort of as we discussed already.
Yeah, just making a couple notes here. I think some of the topics that we've heard from rental companies, seasonality for sure. Like we see data points now across the entire country, and generally speaking, when it gets cold, rental slows down, and that's very predictable. And we have the data to see that, so that could be one data point. The other one is day of week. Mondays and Fridays can be really busy rental days. Tuesdays, Thursdays, you get an aerator, maybe not as busy. So I think day of week, those are like, I'm just making a simple one, like how do you get started, right? Those are very predictable things. Number three, actual utilization. So you can, if you want to be around 60% utilized, well, if you're at 30%, maybe you run a sale on that. And maybe if you're at 90%, you got one skid steer left, maybe you increase the price for that last one, right? And then lastly, competitors, which we can get to in a second. But I'm just thinking out loud, like those feel like pretty distinct, controllable metrics that rental companies could start to use to make simple pricing changes. You don't need AI and all these other things, but just knowing like, hey, it's a Monday, differently, it's a Tuesday, and Tuesdays are slow. Maybe I'll make my price 10% slower on Tuesdays. Simple things like that could go a long way in starting to, move into this more dynamic pricing world.
Yeah. And something that we think about a lot at Uber is like, did this thing that we did work? How do we understand that? And that's often kind of hard to do, right? So what you do is, okay, well, let's look back to how we did last year. Right? And make a change, look at it how we did last year, and then say, okay, do we think this is better? If you don't see a big difference, you can always just, say, hey, I'm not going to do this next year, right? Or next
Mm,
month. You can roll it back. So
mm.
I know that's sometimes easier kind of said than done with a small business running pretty tight margins. But a lot of things we do here at Uber is just, hey, let's try this. Did it work? No? Okay, let's roll it back. Hey, let's try that. Oh, it worked? Great. Like let's keep doing it.
That's a good question. Is how do you measure success? I do remember, when I was at Uber, it was constantly a battle, I feel like, with the data science team to get to, stat sig. Like, how do you actually prove with enough data points that this, you can say 100% or 99% sure this worked, 95% confidence interval, because it always ended up meeting way more data points. And rental companies aren't going to have that, right? If Uber was always, but because if you start to like at Uber, right, you just go hyper local to a market, to a subset of riders, drivers, et cetera. Then you run out of people to like actually get meaningful results. Rental companies won't have that right now. So how do you actually know if this is working? Because you're not going to have the data scientist to say, "Yep, it worked. Here's my signature." A lot of it's going to be gut feel. It feels like.
Yeah, I think it's really tough, even at Uber to understand if something worked. So I'm not going to even get into that situation or like how sort of we do it. I would say for a business, it's like if you can kind of see noticeable change, just looking at just like a what we call a pre-post. So look at the month after, look at the month before. Do you see a difference? If no, you know it probably didn't work. And so yeah, just look. I wouldn't get caught up in the statistics of it. Just if you as a business owner, if your intuition is that, hey, this makes me feel better
Mm,
and my customers are happy and I'm seeing, higher sales. That's, compared to some baseline that you set, whether it's last month, last year, whatever, that's how I would approach it.
mm. I think it's going back to what you said earlier, the importance of knowing your end user, spending time with them,
Yeah.
asking them, hey, you ran with us for the first time. What brought you in? Oh, I saw your sale online. Great. Now you know. And it's the intuition, and yeah, maybe need to run sophisticated randomized A/B tests, but before or after, it's April, May are roughly the same. Revenue increased 10% in May on this product line that I changed prices on. That may be enough to know here, but I think the importance is constant experimentation and also not being scared to roll things back when they don't work. I think the reality is all these things we're talking about, you have to just try it and experiment it in a way that's not going to burn your business down, but in a way you can sort of isolate some of these changes. And maybe you start doing day of week seasonality adjustments on 3 of your products, not everything, right? And start to kind of do it that way. So I think it's, the crawl, walk, run methodology. I don't think we need to solve all the world's problems, on pricing for the industry today, but I think just being able to run small tests and get a feel, is this working or not? The other topic I had was around competitors. I'm not going to ask how does Uber compare with Lyft and all that stuff, right? But like generally speaking, the 3 metrics we talked about, like seasonality is very predictable, day of week is very predictable, and utilization levels, you have that in your rental software, right? Those are 3 things that any rental company can just execute on, right? The other part is competitors, right? Because every rental company's got competitors. They got national competitors and local competitors. How important is competition pricing and thinking about setting the right rates for your business?
Yeah, I mean, it's you don't operate your business in a vacuum. You operate it in a marketplace. Um, Even if you operate a marketplace like Uber, there are other competing marketplaces. Um, I think at the end of the day, um, if you're growing, I don't know, it's kind of an existential question. If you're growing and you're meeting your market, your metrics, how much does growing faster than a competitor or slower than a competitor that really matter that much? I think it's worthwhile to understand, hey, I'm losing business to this competitor because of it can be a number of different reasons, right? They've got better features, better equipment, better pricing, or hey, I'm really gaining against this competitor because of these things. It's worthwhile to understand. Um, but I don't know. I'd say at the end of the day, any business just wants to to grow, to make their customers happy. Um, and I would say it's just one of like many inputs that you want to use to make decisions.
Hmm. Yeah, one of several. And there's a tool a lot of people know in the industry, Rouse Analytics, and you can get uh, as long as you have 5 competitors in your market, they will anonymize and aggregate your pricing from your competitors. So you're priced at $100, the average is 110. Here's the range. You can actually use that as one data point to go, okay, I'm actually underpriced. On top of the day of week and the seasonality sort of changes. The good news is like you don't need to sit in front of a computer and look at your competitor prices every day. There are tools that already anonymize and aggregate this data. Just another input when you're thinking about how do we set rates. Um, well, Andres, it's been awesome. I think a lot for the industry to think about as we sort of started off. Dynamic pricing seems inevitable to come into the industry. I don't think it's going to happen overnight, but I just making the list here of very specific things we could start testing with rental company, right? Seasonality, day of week, actual utilization, and potentially competitor data. We don't need to build machine learning sort of robots here. We can just get started with some of those things. I think the other thing was interesting is around what we talked about on the importance of balancing supply and demand. So it's about the business outcomes, but also the user experience and being more reliable and pricing accordingly so that you are reliable for the people who need it most. I thought that was interesting. So awesome having you on, Andres. I guess final question is like, what are some of the exciting things you're working on at Uber? Don't give us the secret sauce here, but what are some of the cool things you guys are working on now?
Yeah, I'm not gonna get super into the weeds, but I honestly I think You'd be surprised at how much the same themes that we were working on in 2015 continue to come up today,
Mm,
right? How do we balance supply and demand? How do we balance kind of efficiency with customer experience and customer value? Um, all those things are, things that we're working on. Membership always continues to be like
mm,
something that we're working on. I go to our sort of earnings statements, and they talk a ton about membership if you want to read about that.
mm. Well, history doesn't repeat itself, but often rhymes. Sounds like you guys have figured out the metrics the themes that matter, and you're just constantly iterating, right? That's a lot of what it is. And I think the exciting thing is like rental industry doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of what we've already talked about, those themes around balancing supply and demand, how you do it. It's the same across a lot of marketplaces, not just ride hailing. So that, I think for the rental industry, there's a lot to learn from companies like Uber. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing some of the best practices and some of the things that Uber's done well. And I hope to see the rental industry sort of move this direction because I think it ultimately built a more reliable market for everyone, for the rental companies and also for the end renters. So, anyways, Andres, appreciate you coming on. I think finally had someone with less rental experience than me coming on here, so made me feel like an expert today. But anyways, Andres, awesome having you on. Appreciate you spending time with us today.
Yeah, hopefully I didn't put my foot in my mouth and say anything completely stupid about the specific rental industry. So
No, you were on it, so you did a great job. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Andres.